thanks for taking part in the Wrexham.com General Election 2019 Q&A videos. To dive straight in, are you able to tell us a little about who you are, any political history, and why you have the political leanings that you do?
Well, I've lived in Wrexham all my life, so I'm Wrexham born and bred. I've been a county councillor for Plaid Cymru since 2008. But for a number of years before that, I was involved in a lot of community campaigning, so particularly around housing issues, unsustainable development, so helping residents basically oppose proposals for development on Greenfield. And during that process, I came to the opinion that the way decision making was working in Wrexham wasn't the best, and I thought it'd be good to bring a new perspective to the table. So that's why I decided to get involved initially.
The locality of candidates is one debate we've spotted. Do you think it's important that people are represented by those who live and work in their communities?
I certainly think if you live in an area, you do have a different perspective because you're using the same services as everybody else. Your friends, your family are using those services. And if you've lived somewhere all your life, obviously you see how people's concerns develop and change over time as well. So I certainly think that it brings a different perspective to the table when you actually live in the constituency, yes.
So as a candidate for Wrexham, does that clash a little with you previously standing in the Allen Deeside by-election?
I did stand in Allen Deeside. I think the first thing to say about that is that was an election that nobody expected or wanted. It was following the sudden death of Carl Sargent. And in those circumstances, sometimes you don't have somebody who lives locally in the constituency who is able to stand. And that was the situation then. I was asked to step in, which I did.
If you're representing Wrexham at Prime Minister Questions today, what question would you ask the Prime Minister and what would you hope to uncover by asking it?
That's a really interesting question. I think trust is a big issue in this election, isn't it? And I think Boris Johnson's got a questionable history there in terms of his previous employment. He'd been sacked twice for lying. So as a leader, I think one of the key questions I would ask is, when you have that track record and that history, how can you expect people to trust you?
This is the third election in 4 years. People have said that they're fed up with party politics, politicians feel that everybody's the same, they never listen anyway, etc, etc. What would be different about you?
I've been knocking doors for the last few weeks, so I'm hearing that. I think universally everybody's had enough of the B word, as it's being called on the door, of Brexit. And they are fed up with the same old, they're fed up with the status quo. And my message to people really would be, well, if you're fed up of the same old and same old politics, then you have to vote for something different. And I think this is our opportunity to do just that. So obviously I'm encouraging people to switch and to vote for Plaid Cymru. And
not taking party manifesto items, as hopefully the parties can take care of those themselves. But as an MP, you might get the chance to bring in a new law via a private member's bill. If you did get that opportunity, what law would you seek to bring in? I think a key priority for our North Wales Police and Crime Commissioner has been drugs reform, and that is one issue that sits at a Westminster level that I feel needs reform. The Misuse of Drugs Act goes back to 1971, and if we really want to tackle issues like homelessness and drugs misuse in Wrexham, then we really need to look at how we approach drugs reform in a different way. And I think the evidence shows from other countries like Portugal, when you look at decriminalisation, for instance, when you start treating it as a health issue, the evidence shows that that works. Drug-related deaths go down, you can start to tackle this issue, but Westminster are showing no signs at the moment of being willing to do that, so that would be a priority for me. One other issue I would have been keen to work on, and I think there has been some progress on this actually in the last 12 months, would be regulating private parking firms. That's been a huge issue in Wrexham with Island Green and other parking areas as well, and people haven't had an easy way to complain and object to some of the working practices that are going on there. So that's a pet hate of mine really, and that would be something I'd be looking to work on, making sure there's proper regulation. What relevant experience would you say you have for the job of MP? I think my experience politically goes back over the last decade, but I'm also a community campaigner as well. The ward I represent is one of the most deprived wards in Wales. We're dealing with a lot of complex issues there around poverty in particular. So I think I've got a unique perspective that it certainly wouldn't do Westminster any harm taking note of. You've said that you will make the climate crisis a deal breaker in how you vote in Parliament. How would that work in practice, and could that mean that you'd vote against some actually good policies by doing that?
I think we do need bold action on climate change. It is the key issue of our time, I think, and from working in Wrexham, I've supported the youth strike movement locally. It's something we've led on. We took a climate emergency declaration to Wrexham Council, so I understand that the intricacies around this aren't easy. There is no silver bullet, but you do have to look at taking some bold decisions and difficult decisions as well. But for me, I think it has to be the priority. I think younger people are looking to us as leaders to make those bold decisions.
In your candidate announcement statement, you said everyone has been distracted by Brexit, and that means that crucial issues such as child poverty, the NHS, climate change are being neglected by those in power. If you are elected and Brexit's not going to go away, whatever outcome really, how would you cut through the noise to get to solutions for those? I
think one thing you do learn from knocking doors and talking to people is whatever the issue is, sometimes there are a lot of areas that are devolved, sometimes there are a lot of issues that happen on a local council level, and people don't necessarily make that distinction. So for instance, one of the biggest issues that's raised repeatedly with me is the NHS. So the situation at A&E in the Mile, the waiting times there, lack of access to GPs. So the conversations I'm having with people on that issue have to be around how you would tackle that at a Welsh Government level, because that's where change can be initiated. So I'm talking to people about policies such as recruiting 1,000 doctors, 5,000 nurses. That situation's been quite a frustrating one to watch actually in Wales, because we knew 10 years ago that there were going to be problems within workforce recruitment. We knew locally that 30% of GPs were coming up to retirement age. So these are things that could have been avoided if the right workforce planning had been put in place. And unfortunately, Labour have buried their heads in the sand over the NHS. So my message to people is we're going to have to work on a lot of different levels to tackle issues. But there are solutions to these problems. They're not always easy, but they are there. But what we can't do is to carry on with the status quo, because it's clearly not working.
There's a view that Welsh Labour have had a lock on Wales in the Assembly for 20 years and say that services are deteriorating, education, state of roads, NHS, etc., etc. Shouldn't you be running for the Assembly where you'd have more of a say on such devolved issues?
Well, obviously, we're a party that stands for independence, so at some stage I'd hope that all these issues would be devolved, because I think as a fundamental principle that decisions about Wales are better made by people who live and work here for obvious reasons. So I would like to see those decisions made here ultimately, but at the moment that is not the reality. Some of the key economic levers we have in terms of taxation, in terms of public spending, sit with Westminster. We've just talked about drug reform. I think it'd be fantastic if we had the power in Wales to make the changes that we need to actually move ahead with that issue, but we're trying to govern with one arm effectively tied behind our back because of the powers that sit with Westminster.
Taking the present currently, would you prefer to be an MP or an AM?
I think we're at a very interesting time politically, and I think if you'd have asked me that question a couple of years ago, I'd have probably said I would prefer to be in the Assembly. But given the way that the political landscape has changed over the last few years, I think it's critical that we have voices there who are sticking up for Wales. I think one thing, again, that I've been talking to people about is the fact that we don't have any voice at the moment. We're hearing from Scotland, we're hearing from England, we're hearing from Northern Ireland. What about us? What about Wales? I mean, that's a key driver for me to want to go to Westminster, not only to fight Wrexham's corner, but to fight Wales's corner as well, and make sure our needs are a priority, because they're clearly not at the moment.
It sounds like you've read the questions, but you haven't. There's been a lot of talk in the 3 years since the referendum about Scotland, Northern Ireland and England in their own right. But our question focuses on the how. How would you make the Welsh voice stronger in Parliament?
There's an obvious answer to that, isn't it? If you look at the situation in Scotland, and again, talking to people, they're telling me, well, look, I don't want to vote Tory, but I'm not very impressed with Labour. You know, we don't know what their position is on Brexit. They've been very unimpressive in Wales. Where do we go? What do we do? Well, what I ask people to do is to think about the situation in Scotland. Do you think that Scottish priorities are higher up the agenda since they ditched the Labour Party and started voting for the National Party? And I think the answer to that is quite obvious. And I think there's a huge lesson for us in Wales there, that we aren't cornered with just these two options of Labour Tory, Labour Tory. They haven't served as well over generations, but there is another option for us in Wales via Plaid Cymru.
How realistic do you think Welsh independence actually is?
In terms of timescales, I think, you know, again, things have changed so dramatically over the last few years. If you'd have asked me a year or two ago, I would have said I would expect to see Welsh independence within my lifetime. But I think what Brexit's done is supercharge that discussion. There was a poll out in September that showed that 41% of people would support an independent Wales inside the EU if the rest of the UK left. I mean, those are figures that even I wouldn't have believed not so long ago. But I think people are looking at the chaos that's unfolded across the border via Brexit, and they're looking at Westminster and how it's behaving, and they're coming to the conclusion that we can do a much better job of running our own affairs.
Recently, it feels the tone of the debate in politics has become quite toxic, and similarly the tone appears to have changed on social media, particularly towards female MPs. Why do you want to be an MP in that environment? And if elected, how would you fight to change the tone of debate?
I think, you know, again, it's not something I've experienced in previous years, but tensions are high. And I think the longer this election debate's going on, tensions are getting higher as well. So you are getting responses from voters on social media that are much more aggressive than they used to be. Words like traitor are used quite regularly when people disagree with your political position on Brexit. I would like to see that calm down. I think whatever your political opinion is, that we can have a sensible debate and disagree. That's what we're all there for. We all stand on different policy platforms, but I would hope that people can be respectful, not just to politicians, but we've got a lot of canvassers and volunteers who go out for us. You know, none of them are paid to do that. They're giving up their own time because they believe in something. So I would like to see the whole tone calm down a lot more than it is at the moment.
One of Plaid's priorities outlined has been major investment in affordable homes, but locally from councillors, including yourself, there's been opposition to large-scale housing developments. Surely such investment would mean houses being built on greenfield sites, and does that mean that, say, perhaps campaign promises don't apply to Wrexham, or how does that balance?
I mean, housing is a huge issue. So if we're going to go back to Wrexham's local development plan, for instance, you've got plans for thousands of houses there that the vast majority are not affordable for local people. And there is no evidence base locally to build on that sort of scale. So we're seeing lots of applications in for development on green barrier and greenfields that actually isn't needed locally, where the focus, you're absolutely right, needs to be on affordable housing. But it's quite clear to me that we're not going to get that affordable housing delivered through the planning system. So we need to change the way that we think about housing, and we need to think about development being sustainable as well. There's a huge contradiction between declaring a climate emergency and then building thousands of houses that we don't need, for instance. So the priorities are in the wrong place. We need affordable housing, but it's got to be of the right type and it's got to be in the right place. And I think people would understand that and welcome that. I've had affordable housing built in my own ward. That's been welcomed. I don't think there's necessarily an attitude of not on my doorstep generally to housing, but certainly housing that people feel isn't needed is getting a negative reaction, and I think that's justifiable.
Let's putting Brexit aside until later. What would you say is the top issue for Wrexham in the forthcoming parliamentary term, and can you briefly explain how you'd like to see your desired outcome achieved for that?
I'd say the biggest issue raised consistently is the NHS, and I've touched on that already in terms of A&E and GP services. So that is absolutely key. That comes up every time. The other issue that's always raised is the town centre. A number of different issues there. So empty shops being one, about getting the right balance of shops in the town centre. I think there's a sense of loss that you pick up from people in terms of the way the town centre has deteriorated over the last sort of 10, 15 years. And some of that's down to changes in shopping habits and things. Some of it's down to bad planning decisions. So our retail offer is quite broken up. We've got lots of out-of-town retail, and I think there's no doubt that the town centre has suffered as a result. So I think people want to see solutions to that. They've seen things going downhill for a number of years, but what do you do to fix it? So we need to look at policies around business rates. We've fed back conversations we've had from local businesses into policy development within Plaid Cymru. So we have a policy now that we would look at this premium rateable value that you have in town centres, which is just not realistic anymore. The footfall and the income levels aren't there, but people are still being hit with this premium rateable value. That sits with Westminster. So again, it's another policy that's got to be tackled at a Westminster level. We'd also introduce a two-tier rating system to help benefit smaller businesses and encourage new business startups as well. Parking is another issue that's raised in terms of the town centre. So we'd like to trial free parking and get the evidence base for that link between free parking and footfall. because again, our town centres are at a disadvantage in comparison to out-of-town retail and to supermarkets. And the other issue is obviously homelessness and drugs misuse, which is a huge topic. I would say there are, again, things we need to do on a local level. I'd like to see a day shelter in Wrexham. We've got a night shelter, we need a day shelter. We need to support initiatives that are quite pioneering and that are working locally. So, for instance, the Crisis Cafe in Roastay, they're working with that hard-to-reach group of people. You've got a lot of different agencies around the table there. So the DWP, GPs, NatWest, you know, they're all there in the one place. And it's very difficult sometimes to get people who have got quite chaotic lives to access 6 or 7 different appointments. So that is working, so we need to support that. But on a wider level, there's a much bigger discussion to have in terms of drugs misuse, because we're not going to police our way out of that. You know, I think we've got to look at where the evidence takes us in terms of what's working. And as I've said, I think that's around decriminalisation, treating it as a health issue, so we can actually start to make some inroads. So again, you know, these aren't easy issues, they're not, but there are solutions. The problem is that nobody seems to want to do anything differently, and we've got to start voting for a different way if we want a different outcome.
You might pick one of those or something separate, but we're just wondering what policy commitment in particular would you say you're most proud about standing alongside for this election?
I think the commitment to the NHS, it's been a long-standing policy of Plaid Cymru to recruit these doctors and nurses, to push to have a medical school in North Wales so we can get people trained up. And I think that is the one thing that would make a huge difference to people's quality of life. I had a neighbour who posted on Facebook today, he's gone to A&E, he's waited 6 hours, he hasn't been seen, so he's given up and he's gone home. I mean, these really are life and death situations, and we know the staff are working their socks off, but we need to get to grips with the problems at the Myler and in terms of doctor recruitment in particular.
A coalition is a possible outcome from this election, and all candidates will say they're obviously focusing on outright wins, etc., etc. But putting that aside, to force the direct answer, what would be your most comfortable coalition?
I think we've said that we would work with other progressive parties, particularly around the Brexit issue. We don't want to see a no-deal Brexit. We think that would be hugely damaging to Wales. So we are open to looking to work with other parties on a case-by-case basis, but I wouldn't see a formal coalition being very likely, to be honest.
Speaking about working with other parties, there's a Unite to Remain electoral pact with 3 parties, Lib Dems, Greens, Plaid, etc., which is across 60 constituencies, 11 in Wales. Do you think such backroom deals are democratic?
I think the first thing to say is there's no pact in Wrexham, so there will be a full slate of candidates here. There will be myself, a Plaid Cymru, Lib Dem and a Green. So it's not something that's relevant locally. Again, I would go back to the point about us being in extraordinary political territory, and this is an example of parties with very different policy ideas working together in a way that probably wouldn't have been conceivable not so long ago. And I've got a lot of respect for candidates in constituencies who have stood aside, obviously the aim of that being to deliver more Remain parties, MPs representing Remain parties. So it's something that's been done in the wider good because of the concerns about what a bad deal or a no-deal Brexit will do to our communities. Now, whether that's effective, we'll see the proofs in the pudding, really, isn't it? And we'll soon find out.
You've mentioned, obviously, there's no pact in Wrexham. Doesn't that signal that 3 parties don't have a chance here as there's no interest in doing a deal?
I don't necessarily think so. I mean, we've got Plaid standing aside in 4 constituencies. It very much depends on the individual circumstances in that constituency. But one thing certainly that's happening politically at the moment is all the pieces are up in the air. I mean, this is wide open. I don't think we're in the territory where you can say that it's just a 2-horse race anymore. People are looking at what Labour and the Tories have got to offer in London, and they're definitely looking for alternatives. That's the message that's coming back to me on the door. They want something different, and they want Wales to have a voice particularly.
Plaid are obviously keen on Welsh independence, but also want to remain part of the EU. Is the position true independence, or is the policy really deep down just independence from Westminster?
I think, you know, this comes up time and time again, this question. And in terms of the EU is made up of 27 independent countries. So you wouldn't go to France or to Germany or even to Ireland and say to them, well, you're not really independent because you're part of the EU. So there's a huge difference between pooling sovereignty on a voluntary basis on things like workers' rights and climate change, and having the country next door having all the control over your key economic levers such as taxation and public spending. So we're comparing apples and pears there. They're two different, completely different conversations.
How did you vote in the referendum?
I voted Remain.
Have you changed your position since?
I haven't, no.
Was that Remain with changes to the EU? How did you interpret the vote?
It was a reluctant Remain, if I'm honest, because I don't think the EU's perfect. I think it needs reform. I think it's overly bureaucratic. I wasn't happy with the way the EU was turned a blind eye to the situation in Catalonia, for instance, or the way Greece was treated. So I'd have a lot of criticisms of the EU, but by far, for me, the economic argument makes a huge difference, and particularly in terms of Wales. We've got 200,000 jobs in Wales reliant on frictionless trade within the EU. Over 60% of our exports go to EU countries. So, you know, most forecasts you look at show that Wales would be hit harder than anywhere else in the UK if there were a bad deal or no deal. So by far, that's the most compelling argument for me.
You're the party of Wales, but Wales voted to leave. On a local level, specifically, Wrexham also voted to leave, and that decision has not been carried out. Isn't it undemocratic now to look to Remain and potentially have another referendum as well? What would be Plaid's position?
Well, we were told a lot of things in 2016, weren't we? We were told that we'd have access to the single market and the customs union. Everybody remembers the bus with 350 million for the NHS. I think we were told that the deal would be easy. Now, none of that has turned out to be true at all, has it? And I think we undoubtedly know a great deal more now than we did 3.5 years ago. The fundamental problem with this, you know, this is not a mess of my party's making. This is something that was instigated by the Tories, mainly to placate the right wing of their own party. They've held this referendum, but they didn't plan for the what if. They didn't plan what they would do if there was a Leave vote. They didn't define what Leave meant, and chaos has ensued ever since. Firstly with David Cameron, then following that with Theresa May, with her red lines then in terms of the single market and the customs union, which meant that you couldn't get then a consensus around Brexit, which has led to the deadlock that we've seen since. Now, to my mind, after the vote in 2016, I would have supported a soft Brexit. I think that would have been the most logical choice at that stage, but it was ruled out by the Tories. Everything's descended into chaos ever since, and we are where we are. And for the rest of us now, we've got to be honest with people about what we think the way forward is. And I'm quite open, and Plaid Cymru are quite open, that we think the best way forward, when we know what a deal looks like, whether that's a Tory Brexit or it's a Labour Brexit, that should be put back to people with the option of Remain.
That position is mirrored slightly by the Labour Party as well. Why is a vote for Plaid better than voting for Labour on that?
Well, there isn't. Nobody knows where the Labour Party stand on Brexit. I think they're going to decide their Brexit party, their Brexit policy at their conference in the spring. And I just don't think it's plausible to sit on the fence on the key issue, really, not just for this election, but will define politics for the next few years. And I think voters are getting very frustrated with that. And the truth is, if you sit on the fence, you get splinters.
Have you got anything else to add for potential voters watching this?
I would just say to people, if you really want something different, that's what people are telling me. We want to do things differently. We've got to start voting differently as well. Have a look at what's going on in Scotland. You know, they're getting their agenda up the priority list in Westminster. We can be doing the same. And it's about time we stood on our own 2 feet and that Wales' voice was heard down in London.